was a crisp October morning when Detective Jane Marshall received the call. A body had been discovered in one of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods, nestled in a secluded cul-de-sac where money bought privacy, and sometimes secrets. As she approached the scene, she observed the home, an opulent mansion adorned with ivy-covered walls and carefully manicured lawns. It looked like something out of a magazine, but there was something off in the air. Even the morning mist seemed to hang heavier over the house. Inside, police were gathered around the lifeless body of James Holloway, a 34-year-old tech entrepreneur with a promising future. To outsiders, James was the embodiment of success, a handsome, driven man who had single-handedly built a tech empire. But now, he lay sprawled on the floor of his living room, his face frozen in a look of terror, with no visible wounds. Jane noted the faint aroma of bitter almonds lingering in the air, a sign of something deadly. As the forensics team set to work, Jane's gaze wandered around the room. Photos of James and his girlfriend, Lila Summers, filled the walls. Lila was young, beautiful, and captivating, with an Instagram following that rivaled most celebrities. She and James had been together for almost a year, an unlikely pair that had attracted attention from tabloids and social media alike. Lila was the classic image of a socialite, glamorous, poised, and always smiling. But now, as Jane observed those photos more closely, the smile seemed different almost. Calculated. Lila was nowhere to be found. After gathering initial evidence, Jane returned to the station to start unraveling the pieces of James's life. She began with Lila's background, scouring through her social media accounts and public records. What she found painted a picture of a woman with a knack for finding wealthy men, climbing her way up from one boyfriend to the next. Prior to James, there had been rumors of a wealthy businessman who had gifted her a luxury car, only to be left soon after. But Lila was careful, always covering her tracks just enough to avoid suspicion. Meanwhile, the autopsy confirmed Jane's suspicion. James had been poisoned with cyanide. But there was something even stranger in the toxicology report. They found traces of another substance, one that had a sedative effect, likely rendering James defenseless before he was poisoned. Jane's gut told her this was no spur-of-the-moment attack. It was premeditated, carefully planned by someone who knew what they were doing. 2 days later, they located Lila in a luxury hotel across town. She was shocked to learn of James's death, feigning tears as she described their perfect relationship. But her story didn't add up. She claimed to have been away on a shopping trip, but CCTV footage from James's neighborhood revealed her car passing his house late the night before his death. When Jane confronted her, Lila's eyes flashed with a look of defiance. "I love James," she said smoothly. "It was everything to me." But Jane saw through her mask. The woman before her was cold, calculating. As they continued questioning her, small details began to emerge. Lila had recently taken out a life insurance policy on James, worth millions, with herself as the sole beneficiary. When asked about it, she claimed it was James's idea, something to ensure she'd be taken care of if anything happened. The deeper Jane dug, the more she uncovered about Lila's history with men and money. But despite her suspicions, there was no solid evidence linking Lila directly to the crime. She was careful, almost too careful, covering her tracks with the expertise of someone who had done this before. As the investigation continued, Jane uncovered a possible accomplice, a man named Marcus, a bartender at an upscale lounge where Lila was known to frequent. Witnesses reported seeing her and Marcus together often, sharing drinks, talking in hushed tones. When Jane brought Marcus in for questioning, his nervous demeanor cracked under pressure. He admitted to being in love with Lila, and he confessed that she had convinced him to help her obtain the cyanide, claiming it was for a science experiment. "I didn't know she was going to use it to hurt anyone," he insisted. She said it was harmless, just a little thing to make sure James wouldn't leave her. When Jane presented this to Lila, her mask began to slip. She was no longer the confident, smiling woman from Instagram. Instead, a flicker of fear crossed her face. But she quickly regained her composure, scoffing at Marcus's lies and dismissing him as a scorned admirer. Yet the evidence was mounting. A search of Lila's phone records revealed late-night conversations with Marcus on the night James died, as well as a series of encrypted messages about the plan. Her carefully curated facade was beginning to crumble, but Jane knew Leela was still holding something back. In a final push, Jane decided to confront Lila with everything she had gathered. The CCTV footage, the life insurance policy, Marcus's confession. In the interrogation room, she laid it all out, watching as Lila's face twisted in fury. But instead of breaking down, Lila smirked. "You think you're so smart, detective?" she whispered. "But you have no idea what it's like to survive in this world. James didn't love me. He loved his money, his status. I was just a trophy to him." Lila's words were chilling, spoken without remorse. For her, James was merely a means to an end, a stepping stone in her relentless pursuit of wealth and comfort. Jane felt a pang of anger but maintained her calm. She knew Lila was done running. Jane left the interrogation room that evening with a grim determination. Lila's confession wasn't enough for a conviction, but it revealed her cold, calculating nature and the chilling contempt she held for James. However, without hard evidence linking her to the poison, the case was tenuous. The next day, Jane reviewed everything she had on Lila: the life insurance policy, Marcus's shaky testimony, and the surveillance footage. The pieces were there, but they were missing a critical link. She needed to place Lila at the crime scene with undeniable proof. She decided to visit James's home once more, combing through it inch by inch, hoping for anything that could tie Leela directly to the murder. In his study, she found a faint perfume scent on the edge of his desk. Not the cologne James was known to wear, but a floral, exotic fragrance. Jane's mind raced as she remembered the brand Lila frequently advertised on social media, always flaunting her high-end tastes. It wasn't proof, but it made Jane think of a possibility. Lila might have left something behind without realizing it. Jane ordered a thorough forensic sweep for trace DNA evidence. A few days later, results came back. Forensic analysts discovered a single strand of long blonde hair on the back of a chair in the study. Given that James had dark hair, it couldn't belong to him, and Jane knew Leela was the only one in his life with such distinctive blonde locks. This small detail confirmed her suspicions, but it was still too weak to go to trial. She needed something stronger. Jane returned to Marcus. The bartender, still shaken, seemed desperate to avoid prison time and hinted he knew more than he'd initially let on. He revealed that Lila had asked him to drive her back to James's house that night, shortly after she'd arrived home from her so-called shopping trip. She had promised Marcus that it was all part of a plan to win James back, telling him James had threatened to break up with her unless she came to his house immediately. According to Marcus, Lila had gone inside the house for about 20 minutes while he waited in the car, oblivious to her real intentions. "Did she say anything to you when she came back?" Jane asked. Marcus hesitated, his eyes darting nervously. She was calm, like nothing had happened. But then she said, he trailed off, swallowing hard. "She said what, Marcus?" She said, "Now I don't have to worry about him anymore. I thought she meant they'd had some big talk, but after all this, I think she meant something else." This confession was damning. Marcus's account could place Lila at the crime scene and prove her intent, but as a spurned accomplice with a record, his word alone wouldn't be enough to convince a jury. Jane pressed him further. "She didn't tell you about the poison?" Jane probed. "No, she never told me about any poison," he said, shaking his head. "She said it was all just to get him to forgive her, to make him love her again." Jane realized that Marcus had genuinely believed Lila's lies, that his role had been manipulated as carefully as James's. But if Lila was as methodical as she seemed, she might have left one last piece of evidence behind. A forensic search of her car and belongings revealed nothing incriminating until Jane discovered a small vial, hidden within the lining of a designer bag that Lila had recently purchased. The substance tested positive for traces of cyanide. This vial, alongside Marcus's testimony, created a web of evidence too tangled for Lila to escape. Armed with the final piece of the puzzle, Jane returned to confront Lila one last time. She knew she had to provoke Leela, to break through her icy demeanor and force her to confront the reality of her crime. In the dimly lit interrogation room, Jane sat across from Lila, who maintained her perfect posture, her eyes defiant. Jane laid the evidence on the table, the hair sample, Marcus's statement, and the cyanide vial. Lila's face faltered ever so slightly as she looked at the small vial, but she quickly recovered, her expression neutral. "We found this in your purse, Lila," Jane said, watching her carefully. "Care to explain?" Lila scoffed, brushing her hair behind her shoulder. "That could have come from anywhere. Do you know how many chemicals a person touches in a day? This means nothing." "Oh, but it does mean something," Jane said, leaning forward. "We've traced that vial back to you. We know you asked Marcus to get it, and we know you went to James's house that night. So, why don't you make this easier on yourself and tell the truth?" Lila's mask cracked, if only for a second. Her confident smile wavered, replaced by a flash of panic that she quickly buried beneath layers of practiced charm. She met Jane's gaze with an air of forced calm. "You're grasping at straws, detective," she replied smoothly. "James and I were in love. He was going to propose. Why would I do anything to hurt him?" Jane shook her head, tired of Lila's games. "You took out a massive life insurance policy on him just a few weeks ago, Lila. We know about the money. We know that James had recently started talking to his friends about ending things with you. Maybe you thought he'd change his mind if he found out about the policy. Or maybe you realized that you'd lose everything if he walked away." For the first time, Lila's composure wavered, her face darkening as she realized the extent of the case against her. Her breathing grew shallow and her hands tightened into fists. Jane sensed she was close to breaking. She decided to press harder. "Did you really think you could get away with this, Lila? You used James for his money, manipulated Marcus to get what you needed, and then tried to cover your tracks. But you got sloppy. You left behind evidence. That vial, that single strand of hair, they all tell the story you won't." Lila's face twisted in fury. For the first time, her voice lost its practiced sweetness. "Do you know what it's like, detective? To claw your way out of nothing, to fight for every scrap while people like James have it all handed to them," she hissed. "He was ready to throw me away, to replace me the second he got bored. And I wasn't going to let that happen. I worked too hard to be tossed aside." Jane kept her face impassive, even as Lila's confession spilled out like venom. There it was, the truth, raw and ugly, revealing the woman behind the mask. Lila's resentment, her entitlement, and her desperation had driven her to murder. She had seen James not as a person but as an opportunity, a ticket to a life she felt she deserved with Lila's confession. The case was complete. The pieces fell together and Jane could see the entire twisted story. Lila had come from a modest background, climbing her way into elite social circles through sheer ambition and a knack for charming wealthy men. James had been her biggest conquest, her golden ticket to a life of luxury. But when he began to pull away, possibly realizing her true nature, she panicked. The life insurance policy was her safety net, a final payday in case he left. When she saw that slipping through her fingers, she resorted to murder, enlisting Marcus as an unwitting pawn in her deadly scheme. As the detectives led Lila away in handcuffs, her perfect smile was gone, replaced by a look of defiance and cold hatred. Jane watched her, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and sorrow. Lila's ambition, twisted by greed and resentment, had led her down a dark path, ending in betrayal, murder, and ultimately, her own undoing. The case concluded with Lila's conviction for first-degree murder, her cold-blooded confession playing a significant role in the courtroom. Marcus received a reduced sentence, his naivete and manipulation acknowledged by the judge. For Jane, the case was a haunting reminder of the depths of human ambition and the dangerous lengths some would go to protect their vision of the perfect life. As she closed the file on Golden Lies, she couldn't help but think of James, a man whose only mistake had been falling for a woman who saw him as little more than a stepping stone on her way to wealth.